life and to the body politic. A century has passed since the Bolshevik Revolution announced the age of ideology was falling over the world in its brutal force. But before the guns could fall silent on the battlefield of the First World War, the harbingers of a new century of collectivization, concentration camps, gulags, planned economies, one-party states, and death by government had announced the coming of the new age. Even then, the origins of the ideologies which would afflict the world for generations had already been laid in earlier revolutions, the French Revolution of 1789 and the Year of Revolution, which passed through many European nations in 1848. These were but a warning of what was to come to pass in the 20th century. We'll see if I can get my presentation to cooperate with me here. There we go. Very good. One of the fathers of post-World War II American conservatism, Richard Weaver, who wrote the book Ideas Have Consequences, the title of which work was more widely remembered today than actually read, Weaver astutely demonstrated that even seemingly abstract philosophical doctrines can have a profound influence on the course of civilization. Kirk himself observed that in Weaver, in short, I found to possess the greatest originality of mind to be encountered among conservative writers of that period being the late 40s into the early 50s. Again, it's a tragedy that his works are neglected today, though people will invoke the title of his most famous book. Weaver made the observation, and we'll step around just for the moment, I don't have this in my paper. Words, he says, because of their common currency, acquire significance greater than can be imparted to them by a single user and greater than can be applied to a single situation. The community of language gives one access to significances at which he cannot otherwise arrive. His point is that we are inheritors of the words which have come to us and that they have a meaning which transcends the immediate context. And so therefore, the words that we choose to defend and the words which we choose to embrace tell our audience a great deal about what we believe, what we teach, what we confess. He made a number of points about the current civilizational crisis. And already at the point of interest in 1948, he said, practically no one can stand aside from this a sweep as deep and broad as the decline of civilization. If the thinkers of our time cannot catch the imagination of the world to the point of effecting some profound transformation, they must succumb with it. Perhaps we shall have to learn the truth along some Via Dolorosa. The point that he's making is that these intellectual matters are never abstract from the things which we are enduring as individuals. Seemingly abstract speculations of the philosophers all too often become the justification for the creation of ideological systems. While men may be tempted to ignore the books of our enemies, they are the seedbed from which the dangerous new waves of opposition will arise. In their time, the Communist Manifesto of Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, Lenin's Strojelich, or What is to be Done, Adolf Hitler's Mein Kampf, to name but a few titles, have claimed millions of victims in the cause of totalitarian ideology. As a matter of fact, we were having a discussion at church just yesterday about the impact which these books have, and a friend had the rather insightful observation that people don't appreciate that while we talk about Marxist revolution, what few people observe is that men like Marx and Engels spent all of their time writing. If you were trying to simply read the major works of these ideologists, you would have yourself a full-time job. When I was in college in Soviet studies, just the standard critical edition of the most important works of Lenin would fill a space this long on your shelf. And that was shorter than the full 48-volume set of the English translation from Progress Publishers. Marx and Engels was only a set about this thick, but that was a tiny excerpt from the longer field of studies and didn't include works like Das Kapital, the German Ideology, and other major works. The point is, When we think of revolution, we tend to think in terms of the mass political force. That's what happens after the ideas have been expressed. That's what happens as the fruit of the seed planted by the ideologists. Sometimes they live to see their fruition. Quite often they are planning for the long term. They are planning across the course of generations. And certainly in the case of the Marxists, that was something which took a long time to reach its maturity. But it was present in terms of the effect from the beginning. It's been a century of warfare across innumerable battlefields with different ideological parties waging war on one another and against all the traditional nations and cultures of this world. The warfare has also been waged in the realm of ideas first. And in this battle, the past year marked the centennial, as I mentioned before, of two of the great writers in the conflict for the minds of men. The writings of Russell Amos Kirk, who lived from 1918 to 1994, and Alexander Isaevich Solzhenitsyn, who lived from 1918 to 2008, are invaluable treasures at the heart of a rich inheritance of 20th century, and now into 21st century, conservative thought. Both men were shaped by an immersion in the traditions and rural heritage of their respective cultures. And it's precisely that foundation which helped to establish their clear enunciation of what Russell Kirk referred to as the permanent things in their writings. Dr. Kirk observed in a letter from 1963, "The great line of demarcation in modern politics does not lie between the liberals on the one hand, the totalitarians on the other, but rather between the immanentist sectarians on the one hand, and all those who believe in a transcendent order on the other. Surely we have a hard row to hoe, and we may fail, but we are put into this world to do battle. Things are in the saddle and ride mankind more than ever before. I suspect indeed that the modern age will come to smash, and then we will have to build afresh upon old principles. Meanwhile, we guard what Mr. T.S. Eliot calls the enduring things." Or as Solzhenitsyn stated more formally in his 1972 Nobel Lecture on Literature, "And who, if not the writers, are to express condemnation, not only of their own bankrupt rulers, but also of their own society, whether it be a matter of its craven humiliation or its complacent weakness, or the feather-brained escapades of youth, or young pirates brandishing knives? People will ask what literature can do in the face of the pitiless assault of open violence. Well, let us not forget that violence does not have its own separate existence, and is, in fact, incapable of having it. It is invariably interwoven with the lie. They have the closest of kinship, the most profound natural tie. Violence has nothing with which to cover itself except the lie, and the lie has nothing to stand on other than violence. Writers and articles of articles have a great opportunity to conquer the lie." Writing in defense of the truth, of the enduring things, both men transcend the exigencies which were the context for the creation of their works. Thus, unlike much of the samizdat underground literature produced in the mid-20th century in Russia, Solzhenitsyn's writings swept around the globe and were soon translated into many languages, and continue to be translated for and read by a generation born after the supposed dissolution of the Soviet Union in December of 1991. Dr. Russell Kirk's writings also continue to find a global audience, as recent Portuguese, Czech, and Italian translations of his major works offer sufficient witness. The centennial of both the birth of Dr. Kirk and Alexander Solzhenitsyn have been marked by academic publication of new books drawn from their writings. James Pearson Jr. has edited a volume published by the University Press of Kentucky entitled Imaginative Conservatism, The Letters of Russell Kirk, and Peter Constantine's translation of the first book of Between Two Millstones, which is Solzhenitsyn's memoir covering the years 1974 to 1978, the first years of his exile in the West, which has been published by the University of Notre Dame. Both volumes will be of great interest to any student of either writer. Pearson's Imaginative Conservatism is an invaluable companion to Kirk's posthumously published autobiography. The sordid imagination and several biographies have been written concerning Dr. Kirk and his labors in the 25 years which have passed since his death. The most significant of which was Dr. Bradley Burzer's book, Russell Kirk, American Conservative, which was published in 2015. For an introduction to Kirk's thought, if you are not familiar with his writings, I would encourage you to consider His book, The Conservative Mind, which has gone through, it's either 7 or 8 major editions since it was first published in 1953. After that, the best overall summary of the breadth and depth of Kirk's legacy can be found in the Intercollegiate Studies Institute's volume, The Essential Russell Kirk Selected Essays. Solzhenitsyn's Between Two Millstones, Volume 1, begins to tell the story of his time of exile in the West. In an earlier book, The Oak and the Calf, Solzhenitsyn began the story of his life leading up to his exile from the Soviet Union. But as the author explains in his book, Between Two Millstones, and I quote, "The Oak and the Calf, the version of it that I had finished writing after my expulsion from the Soviet Union, was to come out next. There were many dangers to this project, both creative and personal. And the West, legal dangers too, as it turned out." He discovered very quickly that in the West, it becomes dangerous to tell the truth, lest those you tell the truth about sue you. That was not as much of a threat in the Soviet Union, where they would merely lock you in a camp. He found this more daunting, the endless onslaught of the lawyers. The Oak and the Calf, he said, could in no way be allowed to cool. In other words, it needed to be out there. It was part of the immediate warfare against the Soviet Union, as it was not a memoir, but a report straight from the battlefield. The second volume, Sketches, which he said I'm now writing, on the other hand, can wait indefinitely. And indeed, the English publication of it seems to have almost waited indefinitely, in that it didn't come out in the first portion of it until this year. I am unaware of what the schedule is for its completion. Solzhenitsyn defined the two millstones to which he referred in the title of the memoirs as follows. "It was January of 1977. I was feeling smothered and bewildered. How were we to live in the West? The millstone of the KGB had never tired of crushing me. I was used to that. But now a second millstone, the millstone of the West, was descending upon me to grind me all over again, and not for the first time." What he means by this is the combination of the indifference which he found in the West concerning the communist threat, and the venality of many among the Western political and intellectual elite, and the litigious character of Western, European, and American society, appalled a man who had hoped that the West was actually earnest in an effort to check the Soviet advance throughout the world. A decade after the author's death, there seems to be a resurgence of interest in the translation of Solzhenitsyn's writings, and at present the two autobiographical volumes offer the best insight into his life and his struggles. From the perspective of his art, several of the most enduring volumes are his work concerning life in one of the more tolerable of the camps, entitled The First Circle, based on his own experiences, and then also his book Cancer Ward, which again draws on his experience of enduring cancer right after being released from 8 years in the prison camps. They are arguably the best introduction to his literature until a complete translation of his multi-volume series called The Red Wheel finishes its publication. The purpose of The Red Wheel is to set forth in a fictional context the history of leading up to the Bolshevik Revolution. And in terms of what has come out already, it offers an almost incomparable examination of those early years. It's one thing to read the histories of that period. I'm sure many of you are familiar. But Solzhenitsyn has a way of drawing out the character of the individuals who are participating in that revolution in a way which is of enduring significance. For an excerpt from that, his book, Lenin in Zurich, is a good introduction to his approach to writing about the rise of Bolshevism. For both Solzhenitsyn and Kirk, the desire to become writers came from a very early stage of their lives and their intellectual development. For Solzhenitsyn, the desire throughout his entire adult life was to write a definitive history of the Russian Revolution. And even though his understanding of that revolution changed with time, the desire to write the history remained nonetheless. In other words, he began as a very committed Bolshevik. He goes into the Second World War believing in the cause. And it's his experiences in battle, in reflection with other rising intellectuals, that he realizes the real character of the revolution and the cause for which he is now fighting, and pays for that with over 8 years in the prison camps, which proved to be the most important part of his education in this regard. But he never loses track of the central point for his life. And when he survived the cancer, which he was, by the estimation of all of the physicians, he had no chance of living through. When he survived the cancer, he swore to God that he would dedicate the rest of his life to his task of writing. And he fulfilled that. The amount of time and labor that was then devoted to writing about the cause with regard to suffering within the Soviet Union through works like his Gulag Archipelago, to also then his works of fiction, where he sets forth the character of man. These are works of incredible value, and they defined every day of his life, from the moment he was free from the cancer ward until he was called from this vale of tears. The Red Wheel, as I mentioned, thus far the 3 of the volumes have been published. August 1914, November 1916, March 1917, April 1917 has not yet been published. I'm encouraged because there was a hiatus of 20 years in the translation process, and just recently that 3rd volume came out, so there's hope of seeing this completed. One of the key things for Solzhenitsyn was the realization, after having access to the records of the Hoover Institute, among others, was the fate of the revolution was determined already by the early months of 1917. What happened in the Red October Revolution was really nothing other than playing out what had already happened to the Mensheviks. The Bolsheviks were just going to continue that line forward. He recognized the conspiratorial character of what was unfolding in Russia and realized that that was simply a transition which would soon pass. Solzhenitsyn's desire to become a writer was, in a sense, long delayed by the years which he spent in the camps, where, by the way, he found himself in prison because of observations to a friend which were critical of Joseph Stalin. He would remark later about the naivete which both he and his friend demonstrated by actually thinking that they could write in code to each other from the battlefront, not using anyone's name, and think that they were not going to be caught by the secret police. Sure enough, they proved to be at least intelligent enough to figure out who they were speaking about, and the reward was a 10-year sentence, of which he served 8. It was in the camps that Solzhenitsyn began to gather the material for his novels and for his Gulag Archipelago, and it was there that he developed the mental discipline of memorization. Because possession of even brief snippets of writing could result in further prison time. Solzhenitsyn developed a technique of memorization where he would write out a portion of text, commit it to memory, and then destroy it. When he left from the camps, he had well over 7,000 lines of a poem that he had written on this topic, committed to memory. And that when he was done with his cancer treatments, he proceeded to sit down and write out from memory that complete text. And that the art of memory was something which he would rely on time and again in terms of countering the arguments of the KGB, because they were always wanting to drown him in the specificities of, on this date, this event happened in your life. And he'd be able to say, well, no, actually, what happened was I was at this other place, and the people with whom I was conversing were the following people, and it was on this topic. It would leave them dumbfounded time and again. He could counter their arguments because of the sloppiness of the KGB slanders. And when they came out with volume after volume attacking him after his forced exile, he was able to counter the spin and critiques by being able to appeal to fact. Didn't stop the KGB from trying, but it did blunt the effectiveness of their tactic. For Russell Kirk, the defense of the permanent things was a lifelong concern. As he wrote to publisher Henry Regnery in 1987, "What I have been undertaking ever since I was first published nationally when I was 16 years old is the defense of what T.S. Eliot calls the permanent things. My historical books, my polemical writings, my literary criticism, and even my fiction have been meant to resist the ideological passions that have been consuming civilization ever since 1914. What Arnold Toynbee called our time of troubles. Rather than singing Alleluia to the river god, I have rowed against the current of public opinion. As I approach my 70th birthday, I am somewhat surprised that I have not been swept out to the great deep. Indeed, that I have made some headway against the tide of ideology and the fierce appetites of our age. After completing his military service in World War II, Kirk was free to pursue his academic studies. He had already completed his master's degree before entering the armed forces. He went on to complete his doctorate at the University of St. Andrews in Scotland in 1953. His doctoral thesis was soon published under the title The Conservative Mind, and it proved to be a vital philosophical foundation for the creation of the modern understanding of conservative thought. It really defines it in the post-war period. In the initial chapter of The Conservative Mind, Dr. Kirk set forth 6 canons of conservative thought. First, belief in a transcendent order or body of natural law which rules society as well as conscience. Political problems at bottom are religious and moral problems. Second, affection for the proliferating variety and mystery of human existence, as opposed to the narrowing uniformity, egalitarianism, and utilitarian aims of most radical systems. Conservatives resist what Robert Graves calls logicalism in society. Third, conviction that civilized society requires orders and classes as against the notion of a classless society. With reason, conservatives have often been called the party of order. If natural distinctions are effaced among men, oligarchs fill the vacuum. Fourth, persuasion that freedom and property are closely linked. Separate property from private possession, and Leviathan becomes master of all. Economic leveling, they maintain, is not economic progress. Fifth, faith in prescription and distrust of sophisters, calculators, and economists, the phrase is Edmund Burke's, who would reconstruct society upon abstract designs. Custom, convention, and old prescription are checks upon man's anarchic impulse and upon the innovator's lust for power. Last and sixthly, recognition that change may not be salutary reform. Hasty innovation may be devouring conflagration rather than a torch of progress. Society must alter, for prudent change is the means of social preservation. But a statesman must take providence into his calculations, and the statesman's chief virtue, according to Plato and Burke, is prudence. And the canons have held up well against the test of time, and readily present a response to those movements, such as neoconservatism, which have attempted to turn conservative philosophy into an ideology. Kirk's assessment of the state of Western civilization was not far removed from that held by Solzhenitsyn, save for the fact that hope continued to break through in his writings. As Dr. Kirk wrote in a letter from April of 1963, one often grows discouraged, of course, at the confusion of American politics, practical and theoretical. But all this is part of the nature of things. In any time, the great mass of men are moved only by self-interest and prejudice. Of that small minority who think seriously about the problems of society, most are badly schooled, and there is a lag of a generation between the slogans of the politicians and the new concepts of men of intellect. Besides the non-ideological character of American and British politics, in part a considerable blessing, tends to slow and confuse the development of theory in a time of crisis. So far the quote. In Kirk's estimation, a significant part of the problem was that of the role of colleges has been badly distorted in American society. Thus he wrote in 1968, "The typical mass campus is far too big and has attracted a great many students who have no real interest in the real intellectual concerns of the academy. The rootless are always violent, and the lonely and bored find riot a welcome diversion." Comment which is apropos the rank and file members of Antifa today. In the same letter, Kirk noted, "The tendency of the time in this country is to break down the remaining institutions and bodies of principle which distinguish between the things of Caesar and the things of God. Church-connected colleges increasingly would be pushed to the wall if this tendency were to continue, and the whole social order would be increasingly bored and violent, and the realm of the transcendent should be closed to the mass of men." Now, I would just simply observe in passing that 50 years on, that observation is precisely correct, and that what he saw in an embryonic form in the late 60s is precisely what we now see being played out on the streets of many of the major cities in America today. The rootless pseudo-intellectuals of the universities are the ones who are at the heart of the chaos. And those who know no real degree of political philosophy, economics, history, are the ones who now call for socialism and revolution, the elimination of the institutions of our society. I mean, it's really one of those turn on the news and see what part of the Constitution they want to throw into the shredder today. They're no longer settling for merely things like the Electoral College. It's kind of turning to the document as a whole, as we've discussed over the years with our Article 5 concerns. Kirk and Solzhenitsyn were troubled by the inhuman character of ideology, and they sought to combat it. Solzhenitsyn's motivations throughout his writings were similar to Kirk's notion of the moral imagination, as he notes in Between Two Millstones, and I quote, "My goal," he said, is the entire book, the Gulag Archipelago, as in all my books, was to show what a human being could be turned into, to show that the line between good and evil is constantly shifting within the human heart." End of quote. This is precisely the point, is that for both men, they avoid the way of the ideologists, which is to dehumanize those against whom they are speaking. Solzhenitsyn and Kirk could do what we must do, which is to recognize that the evil which has overtaken many in society is one which resides within our own hearts as well, and that the transition from principle to ideology is one which can be taken very quickly, and we need to be conscious of the danger of giving into that sort of a hubris. The line runs through the heart of every human being, and I would simply observe in passing, this is what the Church's scriptural teaching regarding original sin should always remind us, is that root of evil is within us all, and that when we behold what transpires among the nations of men, we are seeing a fruit of the same evil that would seek to devour us as well. Ideologists, he understood, such as the communists, could not endure forever, but who would oppose them now, so as to limit the evil that they would work before their downfall? This was a question which troubled both men. In Solzhenitsyn's words, "To me it was clear that communism could not last forever. It was decaying from within, chronically ill, but on the outside seemed immensely powerful, marching forward with great strides. And it was marching forward because the hearts of the affluent people of the West were timid. Timid due to that very prosperity. But with communists, as with thugs, you must show unrelenting toughness. In the face of toughness, they will relent. Toughness they will respect. But who will demonstrate the necessary toughness? How decisive the next American president's views must be. How unwavering his heart. How will such a president arise?" This, by the way, photo is from his Harvard address, which earned him the everlasting hatred of the left, where he brought precisely these points of critique to the intellectual elite. They invited him in to give an address, and oh, what an address he gave. And they did not make that mistake again. The problem with Western liberals is they kept asking him what he thought, and he kept having the audacity to actually tell them. I think that many of them wished that Sakharov had been expelled rather than Solzhenitsyn, but that would, of course, not been in keeping with the purposes of the East. In both Between Two Millstones, which I did bring along as well, to demonstrate the two recent titles, and in Imaginative Conservatism, one is reminded that both men saw themselves in the midst of all of these endeavors as also those who were the victims of slander. Both of them were subjected to disinformation campaigns by their opponents, and both of them continue to suffer from those kind of attacks today. We do not have time for me to even touch on more than the basics of the attacks on either one of these men. For Solzhenitsyn, what he often found was that propaganda lines which would begin in Moscow would find their echo in New York and DC, and that there were many who either out of willful agreement or out of sheer naivete would mouth the line of the KGB in terms of what they would disseminate in the West. And so Solzhenitsyn found himself described as, a monarchist, an authoritarian. I think what bothered him almost as much was when they'd attack his quality as a writer, and just on and on it would go. And it was very frustrating to him because, how do you respond to a totalitarian regime, which by definition is beyond lawsuits and such means. Solzhenitsyn knew that not only the Soviet KGB, but also Western liberals were vociferously opposed to his writings. And he found that Western opponents thus repeated, as I said before, lies which had their origin in Moscow. Thus he notes in this volume, the particular success of slander, when it is being wrought by a totalitarian state, is that while in an open society all slander can be countered by objections, denials, conflicting recollections, the publication of documents, and the existence of archives and letters, in the communist vault, nothing of this kind is possible. There is nowhere one can object, and the slightest motion in favor of those who are slandered threatens the defender with ruin. The proverb does say, truth sticks like resin, lies run off like water. So I could hold that all the slander would trickle away, that nothing would remain. But there is another proverb that might be cited, including about the whole Progress Publishers enterprise, that there is no smoke without fire. In the end, how many years must one spend in the KGB's loving clutches before one realizes for sure that they have their own chemical formula for producing smoke without fire? This remains true in terms of dealing with Putin and the Eurasianists, is that they have retained that chemical formula for making smoke without fire. And there's an audacity to the lie, which Solzhenitsyn is obviously referring to, and which we continue to see in totalitarian lies. You think that, well, they couldn't possibly be making all of this up. No one would dare to be that bold. Sometimes we see it at the level of the banal. I know that AOC has become kind of a favorite punching bag, but when someone can stand up in public and say very firmly, we have only 12 years to save the planet, and not be laughed out of the venue, it says something about the power of the big lie. So don't be distracted by the stupidity of the liar. Understand the effectiveness of lies. That a lie oft repeated will be received by many as, well, there must be some truth here. That's a very dangerous position because that's what starts to bring about compromise with things which are entirely false. And this is what certainly Solzhenitsyn was contending with, was the idea that, well, certainly not everything they're saying against him can be false. Some of this must be true. When no, they'd simply worked out the chemical formula for making smoke without fire. In the case of Russell Kirk, he was among those who found themselves at the center of the neoconservative purge of American conservatism after offering his critique of neoconservatism in a lecture at the Heritage Foundation in December of 1988. Now, I actually have the singular joy and distinction of having been present for that, because that's when I was still working in D.C. Around the time of my graduation from George Washington University. So I actually heard the speech, and the infamous line where he observed that there were those in the ranks of the neoconservatives who seemed to be confused in the notion that the capital of the United States was Tel Aviv. This appears to be a confusion that in certain circles remains. He certainly understood the importance of Israel as an ally, and what I find fascinating is that for a man who was noted throughout his entire intellectual career for his verbally violent opposition to anti-Semitism, that the neocons, the moment he made that observation with regard to their foreign policy views, tried to label him an anti-Semite. Now, this is a man who disassociated himself from a publication he helped to start, Modern Age, because other forces had brought an impenitent anti-Semite into the editorial ranks, and it was a matter of either he goes or I do, and Kirk left. He had raised similar concerns with William F. Buckley with regard to National Review. And yet, when they needed to make the charge of anti-Semitism, because there's no surer mark of death in American intellectual circles than that, and understandably so. That was the charge to make. So the public attacks on Russell Kirk, Pat Buchanan, the Rockford Institute on charges of anti-Semitism marked a public division between traditional conservatives and neoconservatives. As Kirk wrote in a letter from June of 1989, the Heritage Foundation people tell me that somebody has organized a sub rosa campaign to sow dissension among conservatives or quasi-conservative groups, and that the Wall Street Journal and the Washington Times features are the beginning of this. He was quite right, and that this led very quickly to a break within the ranks of the right and to a defunding of many of the traditional conservative organizations, because the neoconservatives understood in a Gramscian kind of way that by seizing control of the foundations, they would have the ability to defund the right. And that's one of the reasons why it's very important for conservatives to remain mindful of the key role that funding conservative organizations can play. Because when we were relying on the foundations, it was very easy for the neocons and others to take control of the institutions and turn them against us. In the war against the totalitarian forces of ideology, both pen and sword must be employed by those to whom such means have been entrusted by Providence. And this was understood by both of these writers. As Richard Weaver noted in his book, Ideas Have Consequences, and I quote, "It is the duty of those who can foresee the end of a Saturnalia to make their counsel known. Nothing is more certain than that we are all in this together. Practically, no one can stand aside from a sweep as deep and broad as the decline of civilization. If the thinkers of our time cannot catch the imagination of the world to the point of effecting some profound transformation, they must succumb with it." In the battle of the 20th century, Alexander Solzhenitsyn and Russell Kirk earned places of respect for themselves among the ranks of traditional conservatives. Though they were both far from flawless, for both men had a Christian understanding of sin which informed them of their failures. There remains much of value in their writings to teach the rising generation and to emulate in wielding what Kirk deemed the sword of the imagination. Thank you.